Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. This is a series of videos, podcasts, conversations between myself, Glenn Ford, a game designer and developer, and this guy, Mike Hutchinson, also a games designer and developer, where
Checks out.
we talk about designing better miniatures games. We try to anyway. And we've been
No,
having
we definitely talk about it. Whether we achieve anything is a completely different question.
yeah, we certainly flap our gums and pontificate at length. Whether it's of any worth or use is another question
I'm
entirely.
minded to pontificate upon a subject, Glenn. What shalt we pontificate upon?
Well, we have been having a couple of chats about crunchiness and granularity, which is something I've been wondering about, chatting about for a little while. But part of the reason we thought we would do it around nowish is that Mike received a little missive from a watcher, listener,
Oh
reader.
yeah, let me rummage in the post bag. I'll pull out this letter from viewer Nathaniel. Cheers for the email, Nathaniel. He was asking. He's been working on a game recently called If Worlds Collide. Look it up. And on his mind, he'd been working on. He's kind of in the. From the looks of it, it looks like it's kind of the mid stage of the game's design. There's a lot of pieces of it are coming together, and so what's been on his mind lately, he says, has been bigger picture, fabric of game type questions. So a concrete example he gives: in the game I'm working on, a lot of units will die in one hit, or they have the way that people have built them. I'm considering instituting some changes to give units more hit points or stick around better, but that's a bigger picture type question. How long should units stick around, and what should the rhythm of the game look like? And that, I think, that's super interesting framing of this kind of rhythm of the game.
Yeah. So we've spoken a few times before, and it is one of the, I think, the bigger picture ideas of the nature of these sorts of games about laddering and what I've chosen to personally term zeroing. And what I mean by those is most games, people want or try to engender a sense that you're doing something different on the last turn of the game from what you're doing on the first turn of the game.
Yeah.
Um, and they do these, either a lot of board games, particularly a lot of Euro games and things like that, do it by process of laddering, where you build an engine so you can do more, literally do more stuff on
You've
the
got to
last
punch
turn.
a tree to get a pickaxe, to get some stone, to build a house.
Yes, and then in a few turns' time, you're driving around a JCB and trashing entire forests. Um, Generally, tabletop miniatures games don't do that and can't get away with that. And instead, what they tend to do is something that I choose to call zeroing, where at the start of the game, I really don't know what is relevant or important or necessary in this game. I don't know which of the units is going to be the unit that wins me the game. Not really. I'm not really sure what my actual objectives are. I've got some vague ideas. And as the game goes on, units get taken off and removed and objectives get scored, and we focus in more and more and more. So at the start of the game, I could do an awful lot that doesn't really matter, and at the end of the game, I can do very, very little that is very, very important.
Yeah.
And that process of focusing down and zeroing in onto like fewer and fewer, more and more important things, and that both players reach that sort of pointy end of that at around the same time, with around the same resources, with the same pressures to put onto that pointy thing,
Mm.
are a large part of whether your game is like being pierced with a fine stiletto blade or just like smudged in the face with a pie.
And I think that I used to play in a band, and the drummer Ben, often, because he was an audio editor, he is an audio editor as his job. He would often think of our compositions in the overall shape of the waveform. So if you zoomed out, you'd be like, well, it starts quiet and then it gets loud and then it cuts and there's a little thing and then there's a big crescendo at the end. And in a way, I think like uh almost thinking about that like decision making pressure as a sort of like as a sort of waveform across the thing, I kind of find like that maybe is a relevant, because there are some games, I have designed some in fact, so a billion suns tends to peak towards the sort of the back end of the second third, and then the last the last set of activations tends to be fairly, kind of tidying up, and it doesn't really matter. And actually, there's a tendency in games of Malifaux for like the end of turn, like the beginning of turn 2 is super critical and loud, and then like the end of turn 4 and like turn 5 doesn't really matter because most of it's just sort of tidying up and just doing a couple of bits and bobs. So that's got this kind of super interesting like initial alpha strike spike, and then another one just towards the back end of the penultimate turn.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's like, in terms of the rhythm of the game, it's interesting to think about like how many times are we crescendoing? Because if we only do it once, that might be good unless the game's 4 hours long.
Mm.
And if the game's 4 hours long, there ought to be, within the shape of each round, there ought to be enough like, wow, that was good. Wow, that was good too.
Mm. No, absolutely. And I think the thing about like when a game sort of zeroes out the wrong moment is sometimes when the classic thing in a lot of like large tabletop games is the lone dude who goes running off to stand on a hill because that will be a victory point. And it's like, how does he have time to go and do, if you've got the time to just turn a unit away from the main thing and just tootle it over here, then the focus has been lost, and that crunch has been lost. And I think like obviously we refer back to Gaslands, fairly regularly, but I think Gaslands is an interesting one that it has sort of light and shade to it because each
It's a game of vehicular combat available from Osprey.
yeah, if you haven't heard of it. But so Gaslands, because people wipe out or run out of gears throughout a given turn, you tend to have sort of a fat bit in the middle where everyone's activating in a relatively meaty gear, and then more and more people wipe out, or more and more people can't get up until like there's only one guy who's maybe got it into fifth gear, and then usually doesn't make it into sixth, and nothing happens in sixth, and we go back into first, where some people are only just in first, not doing something super interesting. And there's light and shade, and there's noise and quiet, and I think having that rhythm, having those beats to a game are helpful. You want the crescendos of each turn to maybe be a bit sort of more involving than each of the previous ones. Um,
and I think actually you can pick out specific instruments in the orchestra. Just going back to Nathaniel's question about like how many wounds should a unit have, the answer is exactly enough to almost get their story told, but sometimes not. So if you give them a job on the table and it's about the right job for the unit that you've picked, then they should be able to do that job most of the time, except when they really get hammered by the enemy, in which case they don't. And so if they keep dying before they do anything interesting in terms of the game's narrative, then they don't have enough hit points.
Yeah, although of course it's because there's a force of units across the tabletop, and
and like they don't have enough hit points is an utterly what's the word I'm looking for? Like that's just a flippant way of saying there is a mechanical issue that could be solved in about 1,800 different ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, in a way, this refers back. We've got enough conversations on these sorts of things now that a lot of these comments refer back to previous conversations. But we had a conversation ages ago about sort of putting plot armor on parts of your game.
Citation needed, Glenn.
And one of the things, one of the things about Hobgoblin, which Mike is working on at the moment, that motivated Mike to do it, is that feeling when you're playing a big like mass battle game and your favorite unit doesn't get to do anything because it just gets mashed off.
Yeah, you buy a big monster, it's new, you paint it up, put it on the table, it gets cannoned off on turn one. You're like, well, that's not the right rhythm for this game. That's just not that. Like, well, it didn't even turn its amplifier on. It didn't get to.
Yeah, this is the thing. That's the sort of thing that I think ends up being a question about. Your army has a certain number of hit points. Your unit has a certain number of hit points. Now, do you care that every single unit gets to do something? Is it more dramatic that there's, here's my hero. I thought big things of him before he got, and then he turns up and he just gets off on first turn. It's like, is that a dramatic story? Are there movies in which that happens? Yes, obviously that is a certain sort of dramatic story.
Yeah, and in these mass war games, whether they're whether they're recent historic or ancient or whatever, like we do generally like hordes of dudes dying. Like, it's very cinematic, it's very exciting. It's why we paint large armies of toy soldiers. And so in many regards, like, you know, they have, like, many of those line infantry do not need plot armor. In fact, the right thing for them to do to tell the story is to die in droves and spill their blood everywhere. But, you know, if your game is about a heroic figure, you know, almost doing something and then falling at the last hurdle or what have you, then yeah, then yeah. And so I mean, it goes back to that thing that we've said a ton of times about, like, well, what is your game about? Because if your game is about the heroic actions of individual soldiers and it's a sort of skirmish level thing, then, like, is it even important that they all get knocked out? Like, is the zeroing out them not necessarily being able to complete the objectives in their fullest way, rather than actually being removed from the table and sort of considered casualties?
Yeah, it's like, that guy is definitely meant to take a bit of work to take down. Now, if somebody puts in the work on turn one and takes him down on turn one, but you go, oh, that took you mighty effort, it was an epic thing, it's fine that he dies on turn one. He doesn't need to make it through to the end of the game, provided his death was earned, you know. And the goblins that surround him can die in droves every time you bring him to the tabletop. You know, you can't just totally armor certain things, you can't make them indestructible, but you can make their deaths earned. You can make their deaths big beats within a game, big moments within the rhythm of it. And I think, to track back to what Nathaniel was saying, you know, in his question, it's this sort of thing of, how do you feel when the unit that dies in one hit dies in one hit, and how does the game feel about the fact that the unit that dies in one hit dies in one hit? You know, if you're incredibly unhappy that that unit died in one hit, that's probably a problem. If you're quite sanguine about it and you're kind of like, well, it's okay, I've got a bunch of them, you know, obviously it died in one hit, you were putting your focus into it, I've got other tools and I will now unleash them upon you, that's okay. And in turn, if the game, when that thing dies in one hit, the game sort of goes, oh no, we've got no more toys, what are we doing now? That's obviously hugely problematic. If the game is like, oh, that's fine, he's meant to die in that moment, that's one of the beats that we're going through in our story, then you know, as I said, again, with a few of these conversations, it's sort of like, well, it's kind of, how long is a piece of string, you know?
Right. And, like, I mean, I did give this a lot of thought when it came to Hobgoblin, because you know, it's a ranked mass battle game, and so what I want is for people to lay an army out and then get an amount of pleasure from maneuvering that army, because you know, the first turn or two of maneuvering is fun, it's crunchy, it's got lots of decisions and counter, you know, threats, and, you know, trying to outthink your opponent and all that kind of good stuff. And so if things are regularly dying fairly if things are fairly regularly dying on the first or the second turn, then what you're doing is just diminishing that part of the game's pleasure arc. And you're basically saying, well, you know, if your opponent takes a bunch of shooting or direct damage magic, or you're unlucky, then you're going to just get flat out less fun in this opening sort of section of the game's rhythm. But then when units actually smash into each other, the rhythm of Hobgoblin is such that combat is resolved very quickly, and it's fairly like, not it's certainly very far from unheard of that it only takes one round of combat for a meaty unit to essentially meet its death. But it will never do so without also getting to throw its own punches and cause some trouble of its own. So in order to make sure that the rhythm is such that both players get to throw some dice and have some fun, but also, like, you end up taking things off quite quickly, because the rhythm of the game is like, maneuver, massive smash, a little bit of tidy up, good, reset, re-rack, let's do it again.
Yeah.
And that's a deliberate sort of shape that I've chosen for it. And you could essentially, if you I'm trying to maximize the fun that you can get from each of the pieces that you've chosen or get given at the start of the game. And so whatever the jobs that they are supposed to get done, like make it fun to either succeed or fail to do those, but don't make it truncated and like um because that denial of pleasure in operating the machine, going back to like me loving pulling the levers and seeing the machine, like for me it's really important that we at least get a fair shake at playing the game before we find out who won, because I'm less interested in who won, I'm more interested in playing the game. And so that rhythm of, maybe so with Nathaniel, like a whole set of soldiers can be killed in one hit, like if that's in combat and it took 2 or 3 interesting turns of maneuvering, I don't see the problem in that. If it's possible with laser gun shooting from 36 inches and it routinely happens on turn 1, and your game is not about how do you protect yourself from laser shooting with cover and buying the right, science fiction shielding and making sure you've powered up your units with overlapping buffs and stuff, like, then yeah, maybe that one hit death of a squad is disappointing to the person on the receiving end because they didn't get a chance to play the game with it.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a very sort of, dull, crunchy way of figuring this sort of question out, and it is to get a bit of paper and write down what's meant to happen roughly on each given turn.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is meant to score an objective on turn 3. Somebody is meant to score an objective on turn 5, and then you can figure out how many hit points are on the table, figure out on average how many hit points get taken off by the average army on the other side of the table, and figure out how many inches you need to travel to get to said objective. And you can literally do the math, and you can go, oh, well, generally objective is meant to be scored on turn 3. Turns out no one's going to get to an objective on turn 3 because their legs are too short, and anybody that does is definitely going to get their head blown right off by the other guy's shooting.
Yeah, and you say this is tedious, but like quite often in the sort of late early design or early mid, like I will take a piece of paper and I will figure out like what's the maximum ranges of movement, what's the deployment zones, and like where can people strike, because people are going to do that as soon as they try and work out their list. They're going to figure out, where can I alpha strike, what's the deepest I can deploy, blah 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 blah. And so yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's embarrassing the number of times I've played like properly professionally released games and realized that a given unit, if all it does is walk across the tabletop to a given objective, cannot make it to that objective in the turns provided. And you're just like, what the hell? What the hell was that meant to be about? What is meant to be the achievement? So, yeah, I think it's a worthwhile exercise, literally figuring out, writing on
looking at you, Warlord Titan in Adeptus Mechanicus.
The hell? He's got legs the size of a building. Why does he walk like his cat?
They're heavy. Heavy.
But yeah, look, it's a worthwhile exercise going, this is what I intend to happen on a given turn. Now let's look at my game and see whether that is achievable on that given turn. Those were meant to be the story beats, and I do think it's worth like laying out like story beats. Here's act 1, the building up, the realizing who the forces are and what they can do. Here's the break of act 1 where something has been achieved and now we know where the story's going. Here's act 2 where things become quite refined, and there's the break of act 2 where we're down to the main protagonists, and here's act 3 where the main protagonists are finally meet and everything becomes climactic and we break it down, and then there's our crescendo and our fade to black. And what those things refer to in your game, well, that's up to you, and that's up to your game design. But it's worth laying those things out, figuring out where you want the rhythm to be. And then, the game is a weird, nebulous thing with all sorts of throbbing, pulsating parts to it. Compare A to B and see if A happens when B is left to spurt its juices onto the tabletop. And if so, you're all good and the rhythm was correct. And if not, you need to get in and do some tinkering.
I think that there's probably a whole other conversation about that sort of platonic arc of like, what is it supposed to be, what's the coolest story that you're supposed to tell using this rule system. Like, one of the things that I found surprising early on and still catches me off guard here and there is I will start with an idea, and then I'll create like a faction or a force that that does that. And then I will create an army building system where you can create things that aren't that, or a set of factions that do things differently. And then they will futz with the core narrative arc. And then, just like with Gaslands, you'll be like, well, the racers try and tell this story, but the brawlers have to tell a slightly different shaped story, and the shooting guys needed a third story. And so it can kind of be off-putting when you make a game that the way that you play it and the armies that you have painted for your playtesting table do the thing, and then somebody comes in and tries to bring their own interpretation and just doesn't get the same story or pleasure or rhythm out of it, because or worse still, they come and play you at your own game and they do things wrong, and you're like, no, that's not how you're supposed to have fun. And that, I think, is probably a whole separate conversation.
Yes. So, in relation to whole separate conversations, I think we'll sign off on this conversation a little bit. I think about the rhythm of games and some of the ways of looking at them. And
yeah, that was a fun topic. I feel like there's more to say on that.
well, we might say a little bit more about it in the next conversation. But we will have to move on to that at another time. If you've watched through to this point in the video, please do like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us to sort of keep doing these. If you would like to talk about the rhythm of games, if you have like comments and things we'd like to talk us to talk about, obviously we do talk about things that people bellow at us over email or in comment sections, because we're doing it right now. Drop a comment in the comment section. If you really love comment sections and you can't get enough of commenting about things in real time, we've got a Discord server now. It is in the links, the show notes. I think they're up there or over there somewhere, but it's around. You can find it. There are people having games designy conversations right at this very, very moment. Just before
Quick, get down there.
Just before recording, I was engaging in an interesting little chat on the Discord server. So stop in there. There are people asking interesting questions about game design. You can give them your opinions, or if you have interesting questions about games design, why not drop it in and have a community of like-minded and intelligent people assault you for your foolish question. But yes, look us up on social media. We are available and our links are all over the place around about this video. But for now, I think it's going to be signing off on this episode of Rule of Carnage. So thank you and goodbye.
See you next week. Bye.